I'd like to offer a few comments on a very interesting article called The Conversation in the New York Times. This is a conversation between the New York Times' two token conservatives. I say token conservatives because they're conservatives who normally ratify the premises of the New York Times. So they're conservatives who frequently take positions certainly against Trump, but also against the contemporary Republican Party. This is Bret Stephens, whom actually I don't know. Bret Stephens was kind of largely a nobody when I was at AEI and at Hoover. But David Brooks, whom I do know. And the basic theme of this article, well, it's called The Party is Over for Us. Where do we go now? And these two dudes are talking to each other and reproducing their conversation. Basically, their whole point is that the GOP is no longer the party of Bret Stephens and David Brooks. It's now sort of the party of Dinesh D'Souza. Now, not surprisingly, I consider this to be a very good thing. But I want to analyze some of their complaints about the contemporary Republican Party. So, David Brooks begins the conversation by saying that many, many years ago, in fact, going back to the 1980s, he had brunch with me and he discovered an important difference between him and me. He was a conservative, whereas I was, quote, anti-left. Now, for most people, this is a little bit of a, what's the distinction? If you're anti-left, doesn't that make you a conservative? But I think what David Brooks is getting at is he was a conservative in the positive sense. He wanted to do only positive things. But here's Dinesh, and he wants to, pull down the left. He wants to, defeat the left. He wants to undermine the socialists. Whereas I, David Brooks, I have a sort of a more thoughtful, more elevated conservatism. Now, first of all, none of this holds up in any way. No one thought that David Brooks was more thoughtful than I was. In fact, I was the guy at AEI, not him. I obviously went to better schools than he did. But the interesting thing about David Brooks was one of the things I noticed about David Brooks was his craving for public respectability. And this has always been, and Bret Stephens seems to be cut from the same cloth. These are people who are intellectually not secure, they're insecure. But because they're insecure, they want leftist acceptance because that is the only indication to them, yeah, I'm smart. See, I'm smart. I'm writing in the New York Times. Well, the only reason you're writing in the New York Times is you're criticizing the Republican Party. So in other words, you don't realize that you are the useful idiot of the other side. That's the point. But I think these people do know. They know they're useful idiots. They're happy to play that role, in part because it pays pretty well. I mean, where would David Brooks be if he wasn't at the New York Times? Who knows? He certainly wouldn't be on social media. I mean, these guys are plotters. I mean, when you read their articles, they're the first half of the article is, you could call it, elaborate throat clearing. And they only get to the point until halfway through the article. And in a modern age of social media, people are already they've clicked you out. They're on to something else. They're basically watching a TikTok video. It's far more interesting than what David Brooks has to say. So these guys know, and far from them being relevant today, they're fossils. Because, I mean, listen to the idiotic way in which they talk. First of all, this is Bret Stephens now talking about the old conservatives that he really likes. Quote, they believed in building things up, not just tearing them down. Now, what kind of nonsense is this? Because when you have bad things in place, let's take Obamacare. You sort of have to tear it down in order to build something in its place. There's a bad healthcare policy. It needs to be replaced by a good healthcare policy. And so to basically say, well, there's this group of people that just wants to get rid of Obamacare, getting rid of Obamacare is a prerequisite to having getting rid of the contemporary current FBI is a prerequisite to having a police force that actually works. And if you're in the opposition party, as we are now, it's not surprising that we tend to be more against certain things. It's not that we haven't thought about how to fix them. We know how to fix them. How do you fix the tax code? All right, I'll tell you. You basically have a 15% flat tax across the board, a tax that you can basically fill out on a postcard. Very simple. Won't the rich pay more, Dinesh? Yeah, the rich will pay more, but they'll pay more at the same rate. So if you make $1, you send in 15 cents. If you make $10, you send in $1.50. Now, think of how radically this would overhaul the tax code. It would get rid of the IRS. It would essentially blow up the whole administrative state that's devoted to the collection of tax. You wouldn't need 87,000 IRS agents. You wouldn't need any. So it's not that we don't have positive solutions, but in order to get there, you've got to do a critique, a dismantling, an expose of the tax code as it is, and build, of course, public support for doing what you want to do. I'll just close my discussion of all this where basically both Bret Stephens and David Brooks call themselves Hamiltonians. They're like, we're Hamiltonians, on the other side is Jeffersonian. Now, first of all, this debate between Hamilton and Jefferson has nothing to do with the contemporary differences between the Republican and the Democratic Party. In fact, it has nothing to do with the Republican and Democratic Party, even in Lincoln's time. So the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson is obsolete because, well, let's just look at it. Hamilton favored strong government. Yeah, but there was virtually no centralized government at the time. There was certainly no federal income tax. And so for Hamilton to favor strong government in that situation, in the situation of 1789 or 1800, bears no resemblance to someone championing an enlargement of the federal government today. Jefferson, on the other hand, favored decentralizing government power and having more power to the states. To some degree, that reflects Republican policy. But again, Republicans are divided on those kinds of issues. So the bottom line of it is, I just found my IQ going down in reading this kind of article. And these are the so-called intellectuals of the never Trump right. They're not real intellectuals, they're pseudo-intellectuals, and most importantly, their only prominence is due to the fact that they are playing the fiddle for the other side and getting rewarded handsomely for their entertainment.